Hi, I'm TK Greenleaf, and I'm at the McMinnville Public Library getting ready to do an author talk on deep characters in deep space. Can we have them? Can you actually make a character deep enough when you have to give a lot of room and real estate in the story to world building in science fiction and fantasy? We're going to find out. I'm author of the book Duo, which was published in 2015. It is a science fiction novel about an empath who has great powers to heal people who are victims of trauma, and he has brought a patient who has been very captured and traumatized, and instead of healing her, he actually sets her on a path to destroy a colony on Europa, which is one of Jupiter's moons, and he has to leave his cloistered temple and go
Fonda.
very far away
and
chase her down in the solar system and find her and fix what he did before she hurts a whole lot of people. My next book, which is coming out next year, is called Breakwater, and it is the story of two groups of people in a post-apocalyptic Earth where the land masses have become uninhabitable, who are fighting over the world's last coral reef.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out, and a special welcome to TK Greenleaf and Fonda. Thank you both for coming down here in the valley.
Well, I think what we're going to do today is read, each of us are going to do a quick reading, and then we're going to just have some chatter back and forth between us and ask some hard questions that hopefully, and then we can take questions and answers from there if that works for everybody. I'm TK Greenleaf, and I write science fiction. My first book came out in 2015. It's called Duo, and it's the story of an empath that comes from a temple in 200 years in Earth's future, where the monks have developed great powers to heal victims of trauma. And my monk has brought a woman who is a genetically engineered assassin who has been captured by the enemy and tortured, and in attempting to heal her, it goes very badly, and he accidentally does some damage to her brain that sends her on a path to, she's basically going to blow up a colony on Europa full of millions of innocent people, and he has to leave his cloistered life in the temple and chase her across the solar system and try to find her and fix what he did before, the souls of 1 million people rain down on both of their heads. And that's the book I'm going to read from today.
Hi everyone, I'm Fonda. I am a science fiction fantasy novelist. I'm probably best known for the Greenleaf saga, which begins with this book, Jade City. It's an epic, modern era fantasy family gangster saga that I have often referred to as the Godfather of magic and kung fu. And it's planned as a trilogy. The second book comes out in 8 days, so I'm very much in the thick of pre-book madness. It was nominated for a bunch of awards, won a few, including the World Fantasy Award. I'm hard at work on the third book. I'm also the author of a number of young adult science fiction novels. Zero Boxer, which is MMA in space, basically. It's a story of a zero-gravity prize fighter. And Exo and Crossfire, which are my twist on alien invasion story, but set 100 years after Earth has been colonized by an alien race. So I would ordinarily read from my newest book, but it is full of spoiler. So I'm going to read from Jade City, and this is going to be this is actually a flashback, so it's a brief little passage in the book, and the story revolves around a family. As I mentioned, it's a family saga, and there's 4 siblings in the family. So it takes place on a fictional island nation that is essentially ruled by family clans that are not dissimilar from how you would imagine mafia in our own world. And they have a hierarchy. And this one, the the story is from the perspective of one of the clans called the No Peak clan, and the leader of this clan is a man named Ron. He's the pillar, the head of the clan. His younger brother is the Horn. It's a title for basically the enforcer, like the military head, and they have a sister who has left the island and gone away and gotten for an education, and she's recently returned. And they also have a younger cousin who is 18, and he's training to be what is called a green book. So the whole fantasy premise of the story is that this island is the only place in the world with one very specific and valuable resource, and that is magical jade. So those who wear jade, and you have to train for a very long time to be able to do so, have these superhuman abilities, and that makes them of particular status in this society. So the topic we were going to talk about today was deep character in science fiction and fantasy. And yeah, we had chatted over email beforehand about the premise of the topic and why in particular we were talking about this subject. Do you want to share what your thoughts were on that?
Well, really, actually, I asked this question almost as a devil's advocate, but can you create deep characters in science fiction and fantasy when you have to devote so much story real estate to world building? Unlike, literature that takes place in this world, with science fiction, you have to move the plot forward while simultaneously doing a lot of world building. And if you spend all your time doing that, can you have deep characters as well, and without slowing the plot down too much? And obviously, I think you can. But it's kind of fun to pretend you can't, just to say, oh, okay, well, if you're going to do it, how do you do it? And so that's what we thought we would talk about today. And the first question that I had come up with was, what is a deep character? What makes a character deep versus just sort of one that's kind of surfacing? And do you have any thoughts to share about that?
So going to your premise for a moment, I think that dichotomy, or perhaps the perception that science fiction and fantasy wouldn't have as deep characters as stories that are set in our world, our contemporary world, is flawed, because every book of fiction involves world building. So whether or not you are setting it in a spaceship, or you're setting it in 1920s New York, or ancient Egypt, every book has to create the world, and every book has the task of making the reader relate to a character that is not them, that is unfamiliar, and making a reader walk in someone else's shoes. So whether you're making that reader walk in the shoes of a spaceship captain, or an alien, or an ancient Egyptian princess, or a detective in 1920 New York, you have the same task. So I think science fiction and fantasy doesn't have any sort of advantage or disadvantage in that regard. But in terms of what is a deep character, I had this conversation actually with, I was teaching a writing workshop yesterday, and we were talking about character. And one of the definitions that I use when I think about deep character is, do the characters in the story, are they multidimensional, in the sense that you're seeing them in different contexts, and you're understanding who they are in relation to their world and to the other characters in that story. And a way that I think about that is the concept of status. So a lot of, think about any one of us in the room. We have different relationships with different people in our lives. So the way that I relate to one of my colleagues, who's a fellow writer, is going to be different than the way I relate to my parents or my children. Or if I'm teaching a class, I have a different status as the teacher relative to the students versus at my day job relative to my boss. So we're all presenting ourselves differently, and we're relating differently to different people in our lives depending on context. And a character who is not deep, who is two-dimensional, is one that is the same all the way through the book. So if your character is always the tough, badass, hard-driving, alcoholic ex-assassin or whatever, and that is all they are, the entire book, then that is a two-dimensional character, because you're not seeing different facets of them. For me, a deep character is one in which you are seeing that character with different levels of status, depending on how they're moving through the narrative. So an example of this would be, I have a book where, one of my young adult novels actually, where the character is, he is high status in some situations, because he's essentially a security officer, and he is an exo, which means that he's got this biotechnology in his body that most humans don't have. So in some respects, he's high status, but he is also the son of a major political leader, and he feels like he can never live up to his father. So when he's having interactions with his father, that's a very different relationship. And he has a best friend who he thinks of as his brother, and when they banter, that's a different relationship. So you're seeing him in different situations and getting a fuller picture of that character. What do you think?
I think it's a fantastic concept. And I was just thinking about Eamon when you were talking about that, because at the temple, Eamon is the master healer, and he's the guy. I mean, everybody looks up to him. He has enormous respect. And then he gets outside the temple, and the first thing that happens is he gets knocked out and kidnapped by a crazy bird man. And from then on in the book, he's low guy in the totem pole, because he doesn't have any skills for even getting around in society, much less have anybody respect him. And they also can't know who he really is, because that would make things much worse. Yeah, I agree with it. I love the idea of having multi dimensions in terms of status, though. The other multi-dimensional thing I was going to say is that I think if you have a character, depending on whether you're writing in first person, I think it's a little easier to do in first person, but you can have different dimensions to a character depending on how they speak to other people and versus what's going on inside their head. Excuse me. Eamon is very, being a monk and basically kind of a super psychologist. He has a very measured, very calm, very slightly formal way of speaking. But in his head, he's like, what the hell? You know? So.
And we're all familiar with that, right? Like in real life, what we say and how we present ourselves doesn't necessarily always match what's going on in our head.
Yeah.
So the advantage that we have as fiction writers that filmmakers, for example, don't have is that we can go into the character's head.
Yes.
And we can show the reader, hey, there's more going on underneath the surface than what someone would see.
Yeah, right. Or they're smiling and they're really angry underneath, and you know, all that sorts of things. I think with deep characters, there's also so much more you could do. There are unique quirks that can make them so real, depending on you know, how other people are around them. There's an interesting thing about physicality that I go for when I'm writing, and that is that I like to be so. I like to see if I can give the reader the feel of what it's like to be inside the protagonist's or the point of view character's body. In other words, if they're very tall and they're looking down at some other side character that's very short, that feeling of looking down at someone's head, at the top of their head when you're trying to talk to them instead of straight on, or you know, any sorts of bits of physicality like that, I think are extremely helpful in terms of making the character's experience of the world more physical and more real. You know, then obviously there are all the other things that come along, you know, the emotional wounds that characters have that make them deep. Their voice, their tones of voice, which we already talked about, which is very much influenced by a status. A past that drives present behavior, things like that. I always think of it in terms of with my characters, I want to give them a soul, if I can. They're not just arms and legs and a voice. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't.
I don't know if you ever do this, I certainly do sometimes, is as I get to know my characters better, I can start I can end up doing the personality test that you find online.
Yes.
I can sort my characters into Hogwarts houses. I know what like Myers-Briggs type they are. You know, their Enneagram, their like astrological sign, like the sort of tools that people like to use to sort characters' personalities with. I certainly feel that way, that I know my characters better than like most people in my life. Because you spend so much time in their heads, and you have to make so many decisions narratively about how they would react in every situation. Mm-hmm. So I think where stories fall down is when characters end up doing something that readers are like, that character would do that. That's like the cardinal, cardinal mistake of an author is to have your characters do something to serve the plot that doesn't fit who they are, because the plot and character are so inextricably tied that you can't ever have your character go out of who they are in order to serve a subplot point. The plot has to naturally occur as a result of your character's actions.
Totally agree with that. And all of their everything has to be organic to who the character is. And I just have it written right here. Bob would never say that.
Right.
I mean, you can always tell with your characters that he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't say that. It's just the way it is. I don't know about you, but it's so clear in my mind that Eamon would never do or say a certain thing, or Rachel wouldn't, or Zell wouldn't, or any of my new characters.
Yeah.
That's when you know when you've actually hit the character, I think, is when you reach that spot where you know what's organic to them and what isn't.
And when it comes to writing process, it's interesting because I often, when you find that when you start writing a story, you don't know your character that well yet. So they start out kind of like very broad strokes. By the time you finished writing the book, you know them very well, and you go back to the beginning and you start the revision process. And then you're making notes like, this doesn't seem like Hero's voice, or like, what the character do. So you get to know them better. And a lot of the revision process is very character driven.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it totally is. I couldn't agree more. The other thing I say is, how do I know when a character is deep? And I say, when they develop their own agency and they try to hijack the plot occasionally. Or you can almost feel them struggling for free will when you're writing. There is a scene that in Duo where Eamon is talking with the woman who is head of the Akuru Council, head of the temple, and they're having a very straightforward conversation. And I remember sitting there writing that, and suddenly I realized, she's lying to him. Now, I didn't intend for her to lie to him, but I suddenly realized that she was, and it was as if she had developed her own agency and was suddenly doing her own thing, even though the words were the same as what I wrote. And I kind of had this feeling like I kind of wanted to turn around and go like this and say, who wrote that? Where did it come from? But it was like as if she had developed her own agency, and I didn't allow her to hijack the plot, but it did change an awful lot of what happened later and how it was perceived by Eamon. And it becomes a sort of betrayal that ends up pushing him farther down the road that he needs to go. But it is a weird, I don't know if you've had any moments like that where a character just suddenly...
I've certainly had moments where a character ended up... So I'm like a minor character in my book where I sort of intended this character to be like play a minor role and to sort of walk on and do their thing. I actually intended the character to be a framing device, like the book would open with this character and then sort of end. But it was kind of like one of those George R. Martin situations where you sort of have a character that shows out to die at the beginning. That was the purpose. But the character kept just kind of walked on stage and stayed there, and ended up. And so those are fun moments when you're like, oh, there's more to the character, than I initially intended when I was like plotting it out. But to your question, like, how do you as a writer know when character is deep enough? For me, when my readers start arguing about my character. When your characters start having both fierce admirers and fierce detractors among the readership base, then you know that they resemble real people. Because that is what happens to real people, right? That no one is, if you have a character that everyone likes, like that everyone just sort of blandly likes because they're sort of, I don't know, like James Bond, right? James Bond is a pretty flat character.
Yeah.
And you know, but he's clearly a wish fulfillment character. He's always James Bond, right? Like there's not many chinks in that armor. But if you have a character who is acting, you know, true to themselves and is making decisions and making mistakes, then you're going to have some readers who really gravitate because they'll see that in themselves, or they'll be attracted to that, and you'll also have readers who completely disagree with what your character is doing. Like I've seen like my readers online arguing about which of the siblings in this family should be the leader, and like they're quite and and they make good points too, because like they've all read the same book, but they disagree about your characters, which I think is a sign that your characters have stuff that around them that your readers are interpreting them. Yeah. The same way that we interpret the actions of people we use as celebrities and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it also when people are disagreeing about them because they're so real and so well drawn, that they're serving tension in the plot as well. I mean, which really helps pull people through the book or through the story. It's really true. Well, I have a question here that says, why do we want deep characters? That's a pretty easy one, I think, but make readers care. I mean, my thing is that I want to write characters that have my readers hang on the thin edge with them, begging them to make the right decision, and hurting in their hearts when they inevitably don't. Because if they make the right decision all the time, well, you don't have much of a plot, right?
Also, I mean, deep characters are just more interesting.
Yeah. Just more interesting.
I think, I've seen this discussion going in a few times. This like, does your character, if you're a writer, does your character have to be likable? Mm-hmm. And I'm very firmly on the side of they don't have to be likable. We have tons of anti-heroic characters that people are still so drawn to because they're interesting, and characters are interesting if they do feel more fully formed, if they have more going on to them than their role in the plot.
It's really true. I have that point about begging them not to make the wrong decision. I just flashed on this morning when I was thinking about this. I flashed on the movie Alien, the very first one, and Ripley, Sigourney Weaver, at the point where she decides to go back for the cat, and we were sitting in the audience, and the audience is a full packed theater, and you're talking about being on the thin edge with them. And the tension was so bad in the theater that this guy in front of us stood up and yelled at the top of his lungs, said, "F the cat lady, get out of here!" Now, part of it's just tension and maybe not fully formed character, but man, you want to be on the thin edge. I mean, somebody really cared about her surviving. So the question is, the next question I have is, how do you create deep characters without slowing the plot? I mean, because I've seen people create deep characters and slow the plot considerably, but how do you do it without doing that to keep people reading?
Well, I think you have to be developing the characters alongside the developments of the narrative. Mm-hmm. So everything that's happening is showing character development. So I think sometimes there's this, when you look at or first drafts or sort of beginning writer will have like a scene where there's action, and then the action scene ends, and then they have a character scene where like two characters are having a conversation, and this is supposedly developing them. But that slows the story down.
Yeah.
What you ideally want is you want the action scene where things are happening, and the characters are having that conversation while the things are happening.
Yeah.
So you're having the character development occur as part of the plot, not a thing that is occurring separately from the plot. Mm-hmm. The other thing I think about a lot when I'm doing, when I'm writing, and because of it being a secondary world, is I'm making every scene do double triple, quadruple duty. So if you have a opportunity to have, if two characters need to have some sort of emotional confrontation or exchange information or what have you, it is just going to be boring if they are sitting in a coffee shop and you have 3 scenes in a coffee shop. But I'm trying to show the world, and I'm trying to advance the plot, and I'm trying to establish these characters. So I move around. If you have a scene at a sporting event, and the 2 characters are at the sporting event, and they're behaving very differently because one of them is like yelling at the ref, and he's a big fan, and he knows all the rules, and the other one is very uncomfortable because he doesn't like crowds, and he doesn't understand what's going on, and he's new to this planet, whatever. That is, you're building the world, and you're advancing the plot, and you're showing the characters. So by moving them around, you have the luxury, especially in science fiction and fantasy, to be painting the scene in the background while stuff is happening in the foreground. That's something that I think is a delicate balance, because you're always trying to make the reader hold on to the main thread of the narrative, but also being like, oh, I'm slipping all this other stuff to you at the same time.
Yeah, it's such an art, and I think it's harder in science fiction and fantasy than any other genre, is how much stuff you have to slip in without people realizing they're getting spoon-fed a world and things like that. It's just I think you have to do, I agree with you that you have to do it. You have to build a world in everything, but I think with a lot of science fiction, where even in many cases, especially if you have a lot of metaphysics, you have a lot of you can't even trust gravity in a lot of science fiction, and so that doing just what you said is making every scene working so very, very hard. I like to see, in adding into that, you're seeing characters, as you're doing that, you're seeing characters in terms of what they're doing and saying to each other, and then if you can actually show some of their inner world at the same time, that's really another even the 4th layer, I think, breaking through that barrier into their deepest inner world. It's tough to do though. And then seeing how that inner world is influencing what they say and do. I mean, Eamon tries to fix every situation he encounters with empathy and healing. And he finds that works really well in the temple. It doesn't work so well in the outside world where people are as likely to slap him for trying,
A guy like that can be pretty annoying, actually.
I don't think he quite gets that annoying, but he could. Yeah, and then I think with voice and dialogue can do a tremendous amount. Inner dialogue, whenever feasible, can work really well. It's such a difference, and seeing how different the dialogue is between characters. I mean, you've got one character, Eamon's very formal when he speaks, but Rachel's all predator. She's all predator. There's 2 voices. There's this less formal voice in Eamon's head and a more formal voice outside, but Rachel, inside and out, she's just predator. Whatever comes out of her mouth is whatever she's thinking, and she's as likely to hit you as talk to you. So when you push those characters up against each other, you see them in brighter light than if they were 2 characters that are very much the same, speaking the same way. I think also you can bounce characters off the world that you're building. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that you've got physics, politics, society, economics, metaphysics, science, tech, culture, all these things. And how does that influence the characters, and how do they struggle in particular against the boundaries of that world that you've created? And I think or how do they try to enforce the boundaries of that world for other people who are struggling against it? And I think that that makes characters, I think that's a way that you can really integrate character building with world building in that way. And the closer your characters are to the boundaries of the world, whether they are legal boundaries or physical boundaries, the more opportunity you have to build deeper characters and to see how they respond to things and deal with things. That's what So, is character development different in science fiction and fantasy versus non-science fiction and fantasy, do you think? What if the character's a magical being or an alien?
Yeah. I think that all science fiction and fantasy characters, even if they're not human, are human stand-ins. So they're all, I mean, every story about, I have a duology that has characters who are aliens. But every story about aliens is really a story about humans and the experience of encountering people who are not like you. So the analogy that we're creating with stories about aliens is really about how human civilizations meeting and clashing and potentially finding trade or war or a cultural exchange. So a great example, and one of the things that is a real feat of accomplishment and imagination with science fiction and fantasy writers is being able to imbue things that are not human with very relatable human characteristics or thoughts or ideas, so that making them, somehow you're able to make them very foreign and yet pull on the empathy of the reader. And I think that's one of the things that is really valuable about our genre as a whole, is that you're asking the reader to relate to someone who's not like that. Our world could use a lot more of that in general. So as a writer, thinking, okay, like I've read some, here's an example, Martha Wells' Murderbot Diaries. You're so invested in like this character who is not human, who is like a cyborg, artificial intelligence, and yet the sort of situations or the emotions that the character feels are so relatably human that you can put yourself in that. Oh yeah, like if I was a robot, that's what I would think too. So I think that when you ask the question, is character development different in science fiction than it is in not? I think you have fewer shortcuts than non-science fiction writers. Because as a non-science fiction writer, you could say, this character is, a housewife living in Portland, Oregon, who's a soccer mom and drives her kids to school every day. And immediately the reader's like, okay, well, I've met people like that, I know what that's like. So they have a shortcut. With science fiction fantasy, sometimes you don't have that shortcut. And so you have to work harder to show the dimensionality of these characters because your reader can't automatically picture who the character is.
Yeah.
And I find that really fun and challenging. I like that fact because you have more room to play. You have to work to get your reader's imagination to go there.
And it can be mind-blowing. I remember as a kid reading Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, one of my favorite all-time books. And I remember one line from it: "The king is pregnant." It's a book about a planet of hermaphrodites and a human emissary who goes there to learn about them. And that one line. I mean, today that's nothing, but back then that was really like that rocked my stretching world.
Yeah.
It was so great, and I think the fun and the difficulty in science fiction and fantasy lies in how alien can you actually make a character or a civilization and still have enough essential humanity in there that the reader can still identify with them, but just how far can you push that boundary?
Yeah.
And I love doing that.
My favorite Star Trek character is Lieutenant Commander Data. I love that guy. And I remember as a teenager, I read Isaac Asimov's Robot series. And Daniel Olivaw is still like one of my favorite characters in science fiction. There's just something about that innocence, the childlike nature of those android characters,
Yeah.
and them struggling to figure out what it means to be human, that is explicit for them, but is relatable for us, because we're all kind of struggling to figure out how to be human. Like, it's, we gotta figure out how to adult. It's hard, right? So it's just, it's so wonderful when like that connection is made, where you're like, oh, like I am now suddenly relating to like this alien, or this robot, or and feeling a very human emotions because of their struggles.
Yeah, I faced that with Zell in Duo. Obviously, he is a weirdo. And I just needed him to be barely comprehensible, but I thought you might enjoy the story of how I came up with Zell in the first place. I get that question a lot from readers. And people say, that's my husband back there, Todd. Hi, Todd. People say, is Eamon modeled after Todd? And I say, no, Zell is. And, the reason for that is we were in a grocery store. It was about quite late, about 9:30 at night, and it was very empty, and I had lost Todd, and finally I found him, and I would come around the corner, and he's in an aisle, and it's all empty except for him and a very, very old, tiny old woman who must have been in her mid-90s, all wrapped up in the coats and the scarves, and they were right next to each other, kind of looking at the canned corn or something. And Todd had this weird thing where he was learning to do bird calls. And as he was standing there, he just sort of went, and she looked, I saw this whole thing, she looked up at him and she was like, and he looked down at her and he said, screech owl, and he just walked away. And a light bulb went off, and I said, I need somebody like that to bounce off of Eamon, because he's a stranger in a strange land, he's never been outside the temple. I need somebody, and he's so used to feeling everybody out with his empathic nerves, and so he can't feel him through empathy. He can't understand his language barely. I mean, he can barely read his body language, and so he's going to be stuck with this guy that he has no idea if he's a bad guy or a good guy for most of the book.
So you needed a weirdo.
But I needed a real weirdo, and I needed to push that as hard as I could. But I had to keep Zell just that sympathetic and keep people, even if you're not sure if he's a good guy or a bad guy, almost to the end. How do I keep him sympathetic as a character and keep people identifying with him? And he's kind of everybody's favorite character in the book. Provides a lot of comic relief, actually, unexpected comic relief in places. But just getting back to that idea of how do you push the envelope on these characters? You keep them likable, keep them identifiable. Another question I had for you was or you had for me actually, but that's fine. How does the existence of magic or advanced tech in story affect how you create and develop characters?
Why don't you answer this?
My answer for it is what I was leading up to before, is I think the existence of both magic and advanced tech lies in not what you can do with it, but what you can't do. And I think pushing people up against the boundaries of having magic or very advanced tech and then deciding not to use it, not being able to use it, being forbidden from using it. Harry Potter is a perfect example. I mean, an awful lot of the Harry Potter plot, it goes from having the kids learn how to do spells that they're not allowed to do, and then they do them anyway, and hell, and all kinds of chaos ensues from that. And they're not allowed to, a lot more chaos ensues when they're displaying magic in front of muggles, which they're not supposed to do. So so I think that basically the existence of that really comes about in the tension of the limitations of either choosing not to use it or choosing to use it when you're not supposed to, or having it abandon you in a key moment when you thought you could rely on it, things like that.
I think of magic and tech in science fiction and fantasy as a tool and also an analog for power. Because like in our world, you know, there's going to be questions of who gets it and who doesn't. How is it distributed? What's the cost of using it? And all of those questions are really integral to the story world and how this fantasy or futuristic world is developed. So, so your character's relationship to magic or technology says a lot about their position in that society and what their relationship is to the structural modes of operating in that world and really what kind of power they have. So, you know, there's a character in the Greenleaf saga who most of the main characters are Greenleaf, so they're among that cast of people who can use this magic. But there's a cost to it, and health, like serious health consequences if you get too much of it, and much of the story revolves around these characters trying to preserve their power because they are in this modernizing society where now all of a sudden there are other forces that want it as well. But there's also a minor character who is like a street level thief and he has never had this power and it's all he wants. And so you also get the perspective of someone who is powerless in this society because of his access to magic or not. And that drives his decisions. So, so tech in it, both magic and tech, for me in science fiction and fantasy, they don't exist for their own sake. They exist as a way to kind of illuminate the power structures in this world and to give something to give the characters something to bounce off of, whether it's they want to control it or they don't want it at all or they crave it or they're afraid of it or whatever it is. They have some relationship to it.
And it seems to convey a lot of status from time to time probably too as well, right?
Yeah, I think one thing that you sometimes find in fantasy and science fiction that makes for a less robust story world and character development is when it seems like the magic and tech is just there or it's ubiquitous. So if there's like holographic tech and just everyone has holographic tech, that always strikes me as very flat and unrealistic because in our world, I mean, we all have smartphones, but there's parts of our world where people are living in huts. So it is not like a technology in our world is evenly distributed. Clearly there's huge disparities in who gets tech and who doesn't get tech in our world. So it would be the same thing with magic in some other secondary fantasy world or fusion drive or whatever it is.
Right. Or medical tech, things like that as well. Do readers have different expectations for characters depending on subgenres, urban fantasy versus military?
I think they do, and I think it is, you sometimes run across, I think writers often do have to work within kind of reader expectations and constraints within when it comes to different subgenres because you'll find, and this is a question I think you asked earlier, was like, does the science fiction and fantasy get accused of having characters that are not as deep? And sometimes that comes about, I think, because of certain tropes that exist within certain subgenres. So you'll end up with, military sci-fi, and people will expect there to be like the captain character who is a certain type. Or urban fantasy, there's going to be, that plucky heroine, urban fantasy character, badass chick who is that type. And so if you are trying to satisfy, as a writer, if you're trying to satisfy the expectations of readers, you have to be careful not to fall into the trap of writing a type of character as opposed to an actual character. And even if that character is playing into the mold or fits the mold of a type that is very common in that subgenre, your job as a writer is to figure out, okay, like, well, what makes this character their own self? What makes them different? Makes them different than just a character that you could slot in any other character from some other series and have them have the exact same personality.
Yes, totally agree with that. One of the obvious techniques that I see today in science fiction and fantasy is people trying to get around tropes by flipping gender. So they have the woman be the starship captain and that sort of thing, or actually making gender so completely fluid that it's not a factor at all. I think that's created a lot of exciting new characters. Interestingly enough, I think now it's being done to the point where that itself is becoming a trope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing. I think it's one way of switching up the trope, but it can't be the only way. Like there has to be more to it. You can't just be like, oh well, this character is like Captain James T. Kirk, but a female version.
Right. Yeah.
There has to be more to it than that.
Yeah.
So I think as exciting as that is to see, the gender question come into play with character types. I think it doesn't excuse the writer from still making that character like a fully formed person with something more than just, oh well, we're just gonna take this character's personality and make them a different gender. Because it's not that simple. It's like if someone said, well, let's just take your first person narrative and change it to third person POV. Like, you don't. It doesn't really work quite that simply. Yeah.
And I think that, and particularly when the gender switch happens, where it's a woman taking over a male trope, the women's responses tend to be male responses. It's just a female doing a male response kind of thing. I think it would be, what I would like to see more of is a woman being put into a male trope and then coming up with solutions to problems or whatever's going on that is more endemic to women. What I tend to see is they just put a female body in a male role, in a male character. But it's I do think that the whole idea of, I think what you said before, and I think I'm just rephrasing it, is that it's in subgenres, people want tropes, they want the conventions of the subgenre, but they don't want cliches.
I love actually playing in the gray zone between genres. I very much like to mix and blend genres. My book's sort of a blend of crime fiction tropes and epic fantasy tropes, so I like playing in that gray zone. And I think there's a lot of just rich imaginative fun that you can have when you start taking expectations from different genres and blending them to something new. So I always like to do that. So we should probably take some questions. But you did have one question that I thought was good that maybe we could touch on really briefly, was what science fiction fantasy characters do you think are particularly deep and stand out?
I think almost everything Margaret Atwood has done in her series Oryx and Crake. There is a woman character, is a middle-aged woman who is, her name is escaping me at the moment, but I think her character was extremely deep. I don't know if any of you have read the story, but it's the one that's in love with the guy named Jake. She's kind of the main character in the story, and follows through all 3 books of it. Sorry, I can't be more specific than that, but she's one of the very, she's a very rich, well fleshed out character. I also think Mary Adoria Russell wrote a book called The Sparrow. Any of you familiar with that one? There is a Catholic priest in that story who is the protagonist, and he is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. He's as real to me as if I I spent the day with him yesterday.
Mhm.
Yeah. And for all the reasons we discussed today. How about you?
Oh, I recently read a series called Rosewater by Todd A. Thompson. And the voice and the character work in that is very good, very subtle. And it's very literary in its tradition, but clearly with a very strong speculative fiction element. But I think, even more, there's a lot of great examples of character work in more mainstream science fiction and fantasy, like Game of Thrones, biggest, television show in whatever, ever. So, and I think part of the huge appeal of Game of Thrones was that at its core, it's not a swords and sorcery fantasy story. It's a political, it's a story of politics. And all the character machinations and relationships that go on between the characters in Game of Thrones, I think is what made it so compelling to people who don't even normally read epic fantasy.
Yeah. And George R. Martin's willingness to kill people off without seemingly makes it all the more. The stakes are so high and it makes you fall. It makes these
characters
so
make
real. Mistakes
that are true to themselves, true to who they are, and they die for it.
Yes.
And that I think it's something that I think people hadn't really seen a lot of in fantasy before, and was one of the reasons why it was so compelling. Okay, let's take some questions.
Yes. Anybody? Todd?
So Fonda, so your book you said it's a trilogy, is that right? Or,
yeah.
So I guess how did you? I mean, I was clear in the first one you developed the characters and things. I guess how did that change in the second and the third books? Was it more of the same, or was it I want to get it right this time, or what was your thinking about character development in the second and third books?
Each of the books has to have an arc of its own and be satisfying in its own right. But as the story builds, the characters can't just be static. They can't be dealing with the same things that they were dealing with in the previous book. Because each book needs to build upon what came before, but also introduce new challenges and new. At least that's how it was in. Sometimes you see a series where the character is kind of largely unchanged book to book. Oftentimes you'll find that with mystery series, for example, where there's a detective and Sherlock Holmes is always Sherlock Holmes. He's not really changing that much from case to case. But in the case of this trilogy, which I mentioned is a family saga and moves through a decent amount of time over the course of the 3 books, the characters are dealing with different phases of their life in that. So Jade City is very much about these characters, this generation and this family coming to power. And the second book is them facing a lot of other threats and holding on to power in light of the changing world. And then the third book is going to be a lot. Succession is going to be a big theme in that book, and passing on power. So, I mean, the same way that with any of us, our concerns when we're 20 are going to be different than our concerns when we're 30, and are different than our concerns when we're 40 or 50. So, I was very cognizant of these characters are growing and changing, but they are also staying the same. Just like people, there's some things core to us that are always us. We're always going to be a certain way, but we're also growing and changing because of the things that are happening to us and the victories we have and the tragedies we suffer. So that's very evident in the second book, because some things happened in the first book that really changed that family, that have consequences on the way the characters view the world going forward. Yeah.
I guess this kind of ties into that, but how characters evolve over the course of their story, or stories plural. How do you you talked about how when you go back to to like the beginning of the story to like begin the revision process? How you can look at something and go, no, that character would never do that. What about when like how do you choose what they definitely would never do, and like what by the end of the story, considering all this happened, they might? Like how do you establish what grows and what stays their base?
We ask them. I'm making light of that, but yeah, it's a difficult thing to work through. But all I can tell you is that for myself, by the time I've come to the end of writing a book, I know them so well. I know exactly what they wouldn't do. I'm very clear about it and very certain about it, and I think that's a sign that you've accomplished what you need to do with that character. Does that help?
I think so.
And I think that I work backwards oftentimes, so I have oftentimes in my mind how the story ends. Before I start writing, I know how the story ends, or I have the final scene of the television show, if you will. What is the camera focused on before it fades to black? And I know how the story begins. So oftentimes my writing process is figuring out how to get from point A to point B. And if I know that I have a character who's going to end up being, the reluctant ruler of a kingdom by the end of the book, and he starts out as, a happy-go-lucky farm boy, making up something. What do I have to do in between point A and point B to make that feel completely believable, natural, and in fact, inevitable? Like I would like by the end of the book for the reader to be like, yeah, it couldn't have happened any other way. Like it was meant to be this way. And that was how that character was going to end up. And laying the groundwork is the whole work of writing, so that I have to make sure that every turn of the narrative does something that brings the character closer to where I want them to be at the end. And it's what can be annoying sometimes with stories is when I feel like the character didn't earn their ending. We won't talk about season 8 of Game of Thrones. But that feeling of like, I can see where the writer was going. I know why they wanted the character to go there, but it wasn't earned because steps weren't taken in between for me to completely believe that is where the character will be. And like that, I think it's not that balance of like, how do I make sure all the posts are knocked down to get that character development that's the magic of writing, I guess. That's the hard work. That's what you sweat over and bang your head against the wall.
Yeah.
Or for hours.
I carefully plan out the plot points that get my character to that point, where they'll make that final fateful decision. I not only know what they're going to do at the end, but I know exactly what those gates are that they have to cross through to get there, and space them out pretty carefully in the book so that it feels very organic as part of a journey.
You had a question earlier?
Yes. So early on, you were talking about deep character development versus superficial characters, and for a superficial character, you used the example of James Bond. It's obviously a really commercially successful character, and so from the point of view of your own practice, how do you balance making characters that are rich enough for you to be interested in them as a writer,
Right.
versus characters that are going to be simple enough for a wide public to understand?
I don't think it's a false. I mean, I don't think that it's an either-or situation. I think that there are deep characters who are commercially successful. I think there are deep characters who are not commercially successful. I think there are flat characters who aren't commercially successful. And even James Bond, I say it a little flippantly, because James Bond has had many iterations, and I think part of the appeal of James Bond is that he has been interpreted in different ways by different actors and directors. So I think that there is you do have to keep in mind, like, is there something that you can grab onto with this character that allows an in? So like you can have a character that's kind of too inscrutable, like maybe they've got a lot going on, but they're kind of too inscrutable for readers to grab onto early on, or that they don't kind of command sympathy in some way or interest in some way early on enough. So I think, and I may be the wrong person to ask about this because I'm not the sort of person who has written a character for 10 books and managed to maintain my interest. I keep wanting to write different stuff. And some authors have managed to write like 10 or 12 book series with the same character. And so I think those writers have a job of how do you keep that character fresh and doing different things and still growing in a way so that they're not super bored by it, but they're still delivering something that the reader is expecting over and over again. But like an example I use is like is The Godfather, right? You've got like a character who is a criminal kingpin, but the first thing you see him doing is he's at his daughter's wedding and he's holding a cat and he's helping somebody. So you're giving the reader an in and making you like, oh, this is a good guy, and then we're going to show you all the layers and like make him more complex and gray and morally gray and so on. I think honestly that readers, there are characters who are more wish fulfillment characters, that they don't really have to be all that deep. But I think there's also a lot of readers who want deep characters. So I don't have a good answer other than you sort of have to go by what your vision of the story is.
You answered it by just saying it was a false dichotomy.
Yeah. Well, I think there are some readers who don't like deep characters. They don't want to feel. They just want to race through a plot and have all the guns going off and the car chases and all that sort of thing. And you know, that's what they're about, and that's why they read and they like that. I know more than a few people who really enjoy those type of books, and who, if you give them a book with deep characters, they're like, oh God, another scene where he's thinking about something. So I do think that deep characters are not always what readers want.
I mean, sometimes you want the popcorn flick.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I think, but there's room for both at the box office. There's room for The English Patient and Transformers 2.
Yeah.
So I think it's the same thing with novels.
I think
You sort of decide what sort of writer you are.
that's right. Yeah.
I have a question. So for you, in general, does the world come first and then the plot? Or do you have the idea and try to build the magic, the world, the aliens, to build it up to accentuate the plot?
I think for me, it's different with every book. For Duo, the idea of Eamon sprang to me fully formed. And I just suddenly thought, what would it, you see a lot of books with empaths or story, like there's an empath on Star Trek, Next Generation, and things like that, but they're very not well fleshed out at all. And I started to think about what would it really be like to be an empath, and what if it's worse? Really? Well, and I'm kind of an empath anyway, like in a limited way. So in a large way, I think Eamon is me in that way. And then I was writing about my experience of being a little too sensitive in a world that's very loud. I think that. But in my Breakwater, my coral reef book that I'm working on, that idea came about as I literally just wanted to write about coral and how coral, I wanted to write a Sci-Fi book about a novel about that basically taught people and brought people along for and to teach them about how the coral is dying and what you need to keep it alive and. What's going to happen in our future if we don't start caring about that kind of thing. And so it's not a preachy book by any means, but so long story short, that one character, coral book, plot, or concept.
That was my exact same answer, is that it's different for every book. Zero Box, or the storyline came to me first. With XO and Crossfire, the character came to me first. And with the Rainbow Saga, the world premise came to me first. And whichever one comes to you, it's like a part of an oyster, and you just keep accreting material around it. And sometimes you have to put it on hold until there's enough material. So I remember with the Rainbow Saga books, I had this story premise, the world premise, but I didn't have any plot, I didn't have any characters. I just sort of put it in my notebook, and then it sat there for like a year, until slowly, as I kept noodling over it and realized it was an idea that was not going to go away, I started to like add thoughts and ideas around the plot and the characters to it until I had enough for it to be a thing. One more question.
So as you write, do you learn a lot about your character as you write? In other words, you have your plot, as you said, you kind of know the beginning and the end, and you've got an idea for your characters. But as the character goes along and into different situations, are you learning yourself about people, or do you already have that idea?
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm learning a
So
lot.
you're fleshing it out as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I might start off writing a story with the broad understanding of the character, but all the more nuanced things, like how does this character talk, how does he dress, how does he relate to his children, what would be funny to him, like all of the more nuanced things come about through the writing process. So what happens is that I'll find that in the first draft, sometimes you have dialogue, or you have conversations that they just feel like they're overwritten because you're just rambling, you're like figuring it out as you go along. So you might have two characters and they're having a conversation, and it's very like blunt soap opera like dialogue. It's like, I can't believe you betrayed me. Well, you did this, and it's so, because you're just trying to get the plot points out. And then by the time you get through the process of writing, you're through revision, you know these characters super well, you could have a page-long amount of dialogue condensed to like a 2-line conversation between them. Because now you understand the history between these characters, you understand like where they're coming from, and you just need, they're not going to have conversations where they're like, well, in my childhood you did this to me and I've never forgiven you for that. Nobody talks like that, right? But you would have a conversation if you were having a tense moment with your grandfather, or there would be a very unique feel to that. There would be, the disapproving expression that's given over the dinner table. There would be that edge of snark to something that's said. And those nuances, the nuances of the character interactions are what come through once you know your characters and you're deep into it.
I have the same answer, except that I also learn a lot about my characters for putting them in extremis and watching what they do. And I say that as though it's somebody else writing, but it does feel that way to me sometimes. And how I really learn about them is by putting the thumb screws on. And until I do, I don't entirely know who they are or what they're going to do in the moment.
Thank you very much.